Hello, welcome to my presentation. My name is Daniel, and today I'm going to talk about some of the key ideas Carl Jung came up with in regards to the nature of psychic life, particularly the structure and the function of the psyche. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist whose ideas came into fruition and were published during the 20th century. Generally speaking, Jung's theories can be situated within the psychoanalytic school of thinking. My goal for this talk is to 1. Provide an overview and outline the key thinkers and ideas that influenced Jung's work, and 2. Explain and discuss some of the key theories Jung came up with himself regarding the structure and function of the psyche. It's important to note that Jung's theories are extremely complex and far-reaching, so it is difficult for me to explain even a brief portion of these ideas in 20 minutes. In fact, people spend their whole lives dedicated to studying Jung's work in order to understand them. However, I will try my best to explain some of these ideas so that to the best of my ability in the time that we have, so then hopefully you too can have learned something from hearing them. Now, where do we begin? A good place to start, I think, would be to look at some of the key ideas and thinkers that Jung used as a platform and point of departure for his own work. A great person to start with is the work of Sigmund Freud, the founding forefather of psychoanalysis. Freud, for Jung, provided sketches or initial maps of the psyche. Of particular importance was Freud's notion that psychic life can be divided into 2 distinct categories or domains of experience. Firstly, waking conscious life, so our experience with the external world, and 2, unconscious mental activity, which is the unobserved, undetected mental processes that go unseen, but nevertheless have a very significant influence on our behavior and activity. Freud believed that the personal unconscious, as he called it, was the repository for repressed sexual fantasies, childhood traumas, and sexual desires. This repressed material, if untreated, Freud believed would manifest itself in various forms of neuroses. This was important for Jung because he too maintained the idea that unconscious material has a very significant influence on our activity in waking life. What was also important for Jung was Freud's notion that the personality can be categorized into distinct elements. Freud categorized the personality into the ID, the ego, and the superego. Jung retained Freud's notion of the ego, but disposed of the ID and the superego in his maps. Jung came up with a new map, but firstly Jung retained the notion of the ego, which is basically the awareness that probes into and mediates between conscious and unconscious content. Jung added a new structure to the personality in his map, which was the persona, and related specifically to waking life. The persona is basically the structure in the personality that changes and adapts to new environments, new social environments, which caters to allowing the individual to maintain equilibrium, and mesh into the social framework of the environment they find themselves in. So say, for instance, the way you act with your parents would be different to how you act with your friends, and that would be different to how you act at work. This malleability or changeability of the personality is the job Jung thought of the persona. Jung also came up with personality types, which he distinguished as in 4 main compass points. So thinking, feeling, and sensation and intuitive. Each individual can be categorized in or a combination of 2. So say, for example, a person could be thinking sensation, or another combination, a person could be feeling intuitive type. And depending on that type, or the personality type that a person is, this will determine how they interact with the environment. Jung also came up with the notion of extroversion and introversion. So an extroverted personality type would be someone who is gregarious, wants to go to social outings, is generally very boisterous and flamboyant in the way they act in the external world. An introverted type, an introvert, is different. They like privacy, they're very introspective, they review their behavior. Generally, they are silent, they observe, they don't like to talk much. And these 2 types are combined with what I mentioned before about thinking, sensation, and so on and so forth. So Jung combines these in order to categorize individual personalities. So say, for example, and a thinking sensation type could be an extrovert, or alternatively they could be an introvert, or a intuitive feeling type could be an introvert or an extrovert. You combined all these elements of the personality to create a richer picture of the individual. This is Jung's map of the psyche, catered, generally geared towards, the external or conscious waking life. But Jung thought this also has a very significant impact on how they relate to their unconscious. Depending on the personality type, this will set the parameters for how they relate to their personal unconscious and then the collective unconscious, which we'll get to later. But firstly, the personal unconscious. Jung retained Freud's notion of the personal unconscious. He agreed with Freud that there exists a personal unconscious where repressed material is stored, but he disagreed with Freud in that he thought that the repressed material is not just libidinal, so it is not just geared towards sexual drives and childhood fantasies orientated in a sexual way. Jung characterized these repressions as psychic energy. So basically mental activity or mental processes that are not allowed to find full expression to their full extent. If they do not express themselves fully, then they will be repressed in the unconscious, and this will lead to various forms of neuroses or hysteria and derangements of that sort. Okay, so we still see here remnants of Freud's work, but altered. Where Jung differed from Freud, quite largely too, is that Jung thought that the unconscious extended far beyond the reaches of the merely personal. unconscious. Jung believed that there existed a collective unconscious structure, which he labeled as the collective unconscious. So, as the word or the phrase implies, this collective structure is a universal mental space that is common to all human beings. It is an objective mental space that is unaffected by one's personal history and one's personal experiences. It has nothing to do with the personal unconscious. It has nothing to do with repressions. It transcends it. It reaches beyond it. Jung thought that in this space existed archetypes. So it wasn't just a void. There was a content there. There was content. He called this content the archetypes. The archetype deriving from the word or phrase used in the Corpus Hermetica, a religious text composed by Hermes Trismegistus, who was a contemporary of Moses, and wrote a text called the Corpus Hermetica, which was very similar to biblical stories. It has a biblical feel to it. A very interesting text too. The Corpus Hermetica refers to man and woman as the brothers and sisters of God. So its thinking is very different to that of the mainstream Christian biblical accounts. Anyway, the archetypes are basically prototypical mental structures that influence the lives of humanity as a whole. A Jungian scholar, Jacob Jacobi, has likened the collective unconscious and the archetypes to Plato's idea or conception of form. Plato came up with the idea that a form is a perfect prototype or idea that exists in a divine space, and these forms are the templates from which all objects in the material world are copied from. So every object you see is a very dim copy of a perfect prototype. This is very similar to Jung's ideas of the archetypes. Basically, the archetypes are templates for certain personality structures or psychic structures that appear throughout all of history. They are reoccurring themes or images. For example, some archetypes include the anima, the world soul. There is the mother archetype. There is the warrior archetype. There is the wise old man archetype, and there are others. But basically, these archetypes are perfect prototypes that funnel down through mental space and into the lives of human beings. And Jung thought that this was the template for human activity. So say, for example, the archetype of the hero, the archetype of the hero. Jung thought that certain literary texts and even certain figures in history reflect this divine archetype. Say, for example, Achilles in Homer's epic. He would be considered a copy of the perfect archetype of the hero. Achilles goes through a series of journeys. He seeks to overcome obstacles in order to acquire the prize or achieve his goal. This is a recurring theme that we see throughout history also. Let's say, for example, Alexander the Great. he would be considered an archetype of the hero, going out into the world to try and conquer, going through a series of quests in order to achieve what he set out to do. These heroes, they don't know why they're like this. They don't know why they need to go on a quest and achieve what they set out to do. They just are like that. And it plays itself out. They don't know why, but it just unfolds. The archetype unfolds within them. Also, there's an archetype of the shadow, which is basically the dark, evil side of human nature. And Jung thought that the shadow manifests itself throughout human history in the forms of wars, wrongdoing, so murders, things like that. We all contain portions of archetypes within us. So we all have a shadow side, and we all have a portion of the hero, and we all have a portion of the wise old man. But the key idea, Jung thought, was not the archetypes themselves, but the archetypes' function were to bring the individual into confrontation with what Jung called the self being the true personality, which transcends the ego, which is superior to the personality structure. It is the self. Terence McKenna, a Jungian scholar, likened it to what the Hindus call the Atman, the soul or the being contained within the core of the individual. So basically, the Jungian conception of the archetypes or the function of them, Jung thought, was basically that the individual needed to discover which archetype which was dominant in them. So it could be the warrior, it could be the wise old man, and they had to work through the archetypes. They had to confront them in order to eventually come to the indestructible, pure, perfect self, the true personality. Terence McKenna likened the self also to what Friedrich Nietzsche came up with as Zarathustra, the perfect sage, the incorruptible personality. The collective unconscious is not like Freud's notions. It's very slippery and very difficult to understand. But what's important to note is that the archetypes are there in order to allow the individual to come to the self. Jung thought, though, that the collective unconscious is inaccessible unless the individual works through the rubbish buried in the personal unconscious. So they must first overcome their repressed personal issues. Once that is cleared up, then they gain access into the collective unconscious, and then the real work begins. The real work. And this is where alchemy comes in. Once the rubbish is cleared away from the personal unconscious, then the individual can enter into the work of sifting through the archetypes, confronting them, and then coming to the self. This is what the alchemists or the Renaissance philosophers thought of as the lapis, the work. And the alchemists believed that out of matter they could extract the spirit. This was their work, the lapis. Jung interpreted this as representing the archetypes at play, or the individual working through the archetypes in order to extract or confront the self. The quintessence, the spirit, was what Jung thought of as the self. This is very puzzling work and very difficult to understand, but I hope that I've explained it in at least adequately, so you have a conception of what Jung hopefully meant, because am struggling to understand it myself, but hopefully what I've said helps you understand it better. Thank you.